So if I was going to put my finger on one specific precipitating event, it would have been D-Day. While we had been involved in World War One, with D-Day and the push to Berlin, it really was just American forces carrying the load. And once we got a taste of just how destructive industrial warfare in Europe could be, we realized that if we were ever going to contain the Soviet Union, the commitment in troops and lives were going to be something that the American population would have never supported. So we needed allies, and we needed allies that were willing, knowingly, to be cannon fodder in a conflict between the Americans and the Soviets. So we set up an economic system that would induce people to join our side. You've heard of Bretton Woods, you've heard of the IMF and the World Bank, but these are all pieces of globalization. The idea that the United States would use its military power on the high oceans to enable anyone to go anywhere at any time and interface with any partner and access any raw material at any market. In essence, it was like everyone who joined our side would have had all the economic benefits of having won the war all by themselves. And it triggered the greatest period of industrialization and economic growth and personal income growth in human history. And it lasted for 75 years. And that's how we all got electricity. That's how we all got plumbing. That's how we all got the internet and products from China and raw materials from Africa and energy from the Middle East. This is our world in a nutshell. But there's two problems. Number one, the Cold War is over. And even with the Russian resurgence in Ukraine, there has not been a hint of talk out of the Biden administration about reinvigorating globalization. It's a bilateral security series of agreements, and that's it. We actually have not stopped prosecuting our trade wars against even the Europeans, with the exception of one deal with Airbus. Everything else is still going. Biden is still putting body into Trump's tweets when it comes to trade disputes. And then second, when we industrialized, we all started living differently. It used to be that if you had food and coal and iron ore and oil, you could have a modern economy. But that changed with globalization, because before 90% of the world's population didn't have those things. With globalization, you only needed one, and you could trade for all the others. And so the whole world started moving up. That's one of the reasons why the alliance was so potent. Everyone was part of it. But when you industrialize, you start taking manufacturing and services jobs, and you specialize, and you move off the farm and into town. And on the farm, kids are free labor. You have loads. But when you're in town, kids are really expensive, really annoying, really aggravating pieces of mobile furniture. And adults aren't dumb. We had fewer of them. You play that forward 75 years, and the advanced world hasn't run out of children. That happened 30 years ago. We're now running out of adults. And so it's been a bit of a starvation diet as the population has aged. When everyone was in their 20s and their 30s, we got this massive consumption boom. Think of what happened in the 70s with the baby boomers, or in the 2000s with the Chinese. When everyone's in their 40s and 50s, you get this big productivity boom. Think about the United States in the 1990s, or the Koreans for the last 30 years. But then you all hit retirement, and it's over. And for most of the world's demographic structures, we do not even have an economic model that suggests they can function in a world unless someone pays them to exist. That doesn't happen very often. And so everything about globalization is in its final decade. And I would argue conflicts like the Ukraine war are the harbingers of what's to come. There are a series of military conflicts that are going to break out because of changes of consumption, production, investment. And then another series that are going to break out because the United States is stepping back from the world. The Ukraine war is just the first. Right now, we have at any given time over 10,000 ships on the waves that are traveling completely without any sort of escort. About half of those travel within their own region, but half of those by volume are transoceanic. That is the entirety of global energy trade and global manufacturers trade, and it's the input stream for 80% of global agriculture. So if that cracks, you're looking at a catastrophic failure. We've only had to deal with, Somalis and speedboats from a piracy point of view to this point. But we're very close to the position where the United States and the Europeans are going to start grab Russian shipping. And so once the real countries start doing that, all bets are off. Well, I'm going to say a lot of things that are probably unpopular in Texas here in the next couple minutes.
Go for it.
Number one, the United States is not particularly well thought in a lot of its policies, domestic or international. That's not new. This falls into that category. Number two, the greatest supporter of illegal migration in American history was the Trump administration, because the Sonoran and the Chihuahuan deserts are the best natural borders in North America. And by building a wall down the middle of it, we had to build 50 roads to go through the desert to reach the construction sites. And so we took half of the best barrier we've ever had to illegal migration and obviated it. And we would have nowhere near the number of illegals crossing in if it wasn't for that program. Because all you have to do to get to the United States now is cross half the desert and use a ladder once. And Trump took care of the rest. I mean, it's for what it's worth, though, this isn't something that's going to last too much longer. Mexico started industrializing with the adoption of NAFTA in 1995, and their birth rate dropped by half. So net migration from Mexico to the United States has been negative for 12 of the last 13 years. It'll probably never be positive again. Central America started industrializing in 2000, and their birth rate dropped by half. So this is probably the last surge. Within 5 years, this is probably not going to be a significant problem. Well, you've all heard of the one-child policy that was adopted roughly 40 years ago. And the communist turned fascist bureaucracy basically penalized people with fines and up to jail time if they had more than one kid. It got to the point that there were a lot of forced abortions. You do that for 40 years. And you've guaranteed that your population under age 30 will be half of what it was before. But that wasn't the only thing going on. At the same time that the one-child policy was at its height, the Chinese were rapidly industrializing, and they were moving off the farm and into the cities and having fewer kids anyway. So it has been the fastest population collapse in human history, faster than the Black Death in Europe. And it's left us with a population now that cannot regenerate. So a few years ago, the Chinese finally realized that they may have overcompensated a little bit and changed it to a two-child policy. Now it's a three-child policy, and I think it's in the process of being formally abandoned. And the bureaucrats that were once responsible for the forced abortions are now responsible for encouraging people to have more kids. But China's already urbanized. Everyone's already living in efficiency apartments. There's no room for the kids in their lives, physically or mentally. And so the birth rate is actually continuing to drop. And in places like Beijing and Shanghai, on average, a woman only has 0.75 kids over their lifetimes now. So it's not that we're below replacement. We were below replacement 30 years ago. We are now in full-on population collapse. And the Chinese are grudgingly admitting publicly that they have overcounted their population by 100 million in that time, suggesting that we are looking at full demographic and economic collapse this decade, assuming nothing else goes wrong. And in just the last week, the Biden administration basically killed their entire tech sector. So plenty of other things are going wrong. I'm of a minority. I don't think that Taiwan is any meaningful danger. Their economy is partially integrated with the mainland. I think that's the biggest point of exposure. I think that was